Let's talk about torso anatomy. I'm going to run through all of the different parts of the anatomy. Here we're just going to be talking about the torso. This is mainly to give us an idea of what the names of things are, sort of what they're like, things to watch out for. This is mainly a what is it and where is it kind of a thing, and to sort of get us used to the names. So off to the right, you'll see a handout that there is a link to that you can refer to, already filled out. And I'm going to work my way through this handout and make sure that we cover each of the individual parts of the torso. I'm going to go out of order here. I'm not going to go 1 through 16, just one after the other. I'm going to talk about the bones and bony landmarks first, and then I'm going to talk about the muscles after that. It makes a little more sense to do it that way, but it made more sense to mix them in the handout so that they fit on the page better. So the first thing I want to talk about is the sternal notch. That's number 2 here on the handout. The sternal notch has to do with this bone here, this green, strange looking bone. This center bone is called your sternum. So the sternal notch is found at the top of that sternum. It's this indentation right here. On the model, you see right where this 2 is pointing. That is your sternal notch. And you can feel this on yourself if you put your finger just at the base of your neck. Especially if you turn your head from side to side, you'll feel an indentation right there. That's the top of this sternum bone, and these 2 other bones, they're called clavicles. Those bones together make this depression. And this is a great landmark to know because it kind of represents our center of balance. If you're balanced, like if you stand up and take your weight off one foot and stand on one foot, this point will be directly vertical above your foot that's bearing your weight. If you get this point out of alignment with the feet, it can start making the figure feel like they're going to tip over. So that's a great one to know. It's also one of the connect the dots along the front of the torso. So you have the sternal notch, you have this bony landmark we'll talk about. You have the navel, which you don't see in this because the soft tissues are gone, and you have the pubis. That's sort of our connect the dots for what the front of the body is doing. And the topmost one is that sternal notch. Okay, let's move on. Number 4, that's the xiphoid process of the sternum. Weird name, I didn't name it, but that's this little bony thing that juts down. It's where the ribs meet, so you can feel that on yourself if you kind of feel up your ribs maybe, and you can feel where they meet. That's called the xiphoid process of the sternum. You'll notice on the handout, the bony landmarks, and it notes that up here at the top. The bony landmarks are these ones that have the white circle. If you see a white circle in any of your handouts, that means you're looking at a bony landmark, something bony that sticks out on the body. Let's move down to number 8, and we're going to call this ASIS in this class. It's called anterior superior iliac spine. It's this bony jut there, that bony jut there on the hips. This is often a really good landmark. There are several muscles of the thigh that originate right around this point, and it serves as kind of the divider between the upper body and lower body. So that, along with 9, which is the pubis, together they form this triangle in the front of the body. And the lower part of that triangle, so this V shape, it separates the muscles that go up into the upper body and the muscles that go down into the legs. There aren't any muscles that you can see externally that cross that boundary. So that V is a really good one to understand, to know where it's at. And being able to find those points of the ASIS and the pubis is part of that. And again, that's number 8 ASIS, number 9 pubis. Okay, let's look on the back real quick. So the spine, which we're all familiar with, I'll go ahead and highlight that here. The spine is made up of 24 individual small bones called vertebrae, singular vertebra. There's one of those that's actually a really helpful landmark to know, and we're going to look at it here. It's this green one. Let's zoom on in. This vertebra is called the 7th cervical vertebra. That's number 10 over here. And this is a really helpful bone to know because of what the muscles do around it on the back. So if at the base of your neck in the back, you might feel this bump, this bony bump. If you push too hard, kind of hurts. That's the spinous process. You don't have to know that name, but that's this part of that vertebra jutting out. So that serves as a pretty decent landmark on the back. No matter how much muscle you get, that juts out. No matter how skinny you get, that juts out. So that bone right there, that 7th cervical vertebra, helps us orient ourselves in the back, and we'll see that when we get to the muscles. Okay, the next thing to look at is number 16, and that is, we're going to call it pieces. That is these two bony protrusions in the lower back. And often, more often than not, I would say, they show up as indentations in the lower back. Together with the tailbone, which is this part down here, true anatomical name is coccyx, they make a thinner triangle in the lower back. This is the base of the spine. If you can find this triangle in your model, you can build the spine more convincingly from that triangle. So be on the lookout for two divots. They really don't turn into bumps that stick out unless the model is really thin, really doesn't have a lot of muscle mass. Most people, these show up as divots, indentations in the lower back. And the pieces stands for posterior superior iliac spine, but you don't need to know the whole thing. We're just going to call it pieces in this class. So that does it for the bones. Those are the bony landmarks that we're going to refer to, we're going to orient ourselves with on the torso. Okay, let's look at the muscles on this handout. The first one, and I apologize for the name, I did not name these muscles. It's this muscle here. It's a muscle in the neck called Sternocleidomastoidias, or the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Most names of muscles in the body, this is worth remembering. It either tells you what the shape is like, what the muscle does, or where the muscle is, or some combination of those. So this is a muscle that tells you in the name where it is. We talked about the sternum before, this green bone. It attaches to that bone, that sternum, that's where the sterno comes from. It attaches to the clavicle, that's where the cleido comes from. And then mastoideus, it attaches to this bump in the base of the skull there called the mastoid process. So sternocleidomastoideus, or sternocleidomastoid. One thing to note about this muscle is that you can see it from the front as well as the back. So in the front, it comes out from behind the jaw and heads towards that sternal notch in this V shape, so one on either side. Too often we draw the neck as like a column and then down to the shoulders, and that's it, with a head perched atop. That's not really a great way to think of it. I like to think of it as kind of two inverted triangles almost. So you have this V or triangle, and then you have this triangle as well. And you might even be able to turn that into a triangle. That has more neck structure to it, even though it's kind of strange. A V like this, the chin, that's gonna feel like a neck already better than this ever will. Okay, that's sternocleidomastoideus, and here you can see it from the back, and you can see it from the back as well. The side of the neck as it heads in front of this big muscle on the back, which we'll talk about. All right, let's look at some muscles we're probably familiar with. This big muscle on the front, high school weightlifters know all about it. This is your Pectoralis Major muscle. And the thing to note about this muscle is, and all muscles really, if you can remember these things, really helpful. Where it starts is here, down the sternum, and a little bit onto the ribs. So this whole pink region is where the muscle starts, and where it ends is right out here on the bone of the upper arm. So when this muscle gets shorter, when those muscle fibers contract, it's gonna pull the arm forward. Right? And that's a really important motion for humans, being able to push that way. That's why the muscle is so big. All right, that's Pectoralis Major. Let's look at a muscle that we can miss quite easily. It's this one here. Number 5, Serratus Anterior. It gives us this nice jagged edge in the front, and that's where its name comes from, that jagged edge in the front. Serrated means having teeth. It's got teeth on it, like a serrated knife has a bunch of teeth. This is the same, this zigzag just under the armpit. This shows you a little bit more what it's like. It attaches to all of the ribs and then back onto this bone of the arm. Okay, the next muscle is number 6, Rectus Abdominus. This muscle is just the muscle that goes straight down the front of the abdomen, Rectus Abdominus, what we know as our abs, and they attach to the ribs up here, the sternum a little bit, and then down. They attach on the pubis as well. Don't need to go into too much depth with those, except for that they are separated by these tendinous intersections. So any of these light yellow regions, and I'll say that for anything we see in this model, the light yellow regions mean it's tendon mostly, and the red or orange means muscle fibers. So when your abs get larger and larger, these independent islands of muscle get bigger and bigger, but those intersections, those tendons, they stay the same, thin, and that's what gives the separation between these muscles. Next on the list, number 7, is the external abdominal oblique. We'll just call them abdominal obliques because we don't really see the internal ones. These make up the bulk of your side coming down. So the rectus abdominis is underneath the sheet of tendon here. These muscles, including love handle area, stretches from serratus anterior up here in the ribs down into the love handle area, but stops at ACIS. Doesn't go any further down than ACIS. You can see this one from the back as well. There it is, pretty clearly from the back. Here's a picture of that muscle without everything else there. So you can see it attaches onto the pubis, along the hips, and onto these ribs. And if it were to get shorter, when this muscle contracts, it pulls the rib cage down and forward so you get that twisting motion. All right, let's move on to the back. Big muscle here on the back that stretches from the base of the skull here all the way down the spine. Any guesses what's in that area right there? That's where that 7th cervical vertebra is. Carries on down about mid-back. So the muscle stretches from the base of your skull to the middle of your back, and then it takes a diagonal turn and attaches right along the shoulder, that bone of the arm that we talked about. That bone is called the scapula, I believe I mentioned. And we'll talk about it specifically in the arm, but it's hard to draw a border. Where does the arm begin and the torso end? It's not as clear cut as we might think. So this is a rather big muscle, this trapezius. It's quite large. Because of that, it makes for a really excellent landmark to know in the back. If you can find out what this muscle is doing, you've solved just about a third of the back, maybe more. That's this number 11. It's called trapezius. I'm going to skip real quick because there's another big muscle in the back that's helpful to know, and it's this one. This is number 14. You can see him up here in the top corner of my anatomy program as well. This is Latissimus Dorsi, and it does a similar thing to the trapezius muscle in that it attaches from your sacrum, your tailbone, all the way up to the middle of your back. It goes underneath trapezius, you see there, and then it swoops around forward and attaches to the bone of your upper arm. So this muscle gets a lot of workout when you're doing pull-ups or when you're pulling down on things. It's a big, broad, flat sheet of muscle, and it's called Latissimus Dorsi. And if we look at where it attaches, it's like this. So there it is, attached all down the spine and onto the hips, and it triangles up into the arm right there and attaches to the arm. Okay, with those two muscles, if you can figure out those two muscles, then you kind of have most of the back figured out. And there's that abdominal oblique that we already looked at. Don't worry about that little tiny one. We're not going to talk about it. There's a few little tiny ones in here we're not going to talk about. The other muscles you need to find are just inside this triangle right here. And let's take a look at those. There's 2 of them that we're going to pay attention to. So don't worry about these small ones in here. They generally don't show up unless the model is really quite built. The other 2 do, however. The first one is called Infraspinatus, and it is this muscle here. So it tucks underneath both of those muscles, but we can often see this one as a bulge. It's called Infraspinatus. And then the other one is called Teres Major, and this one is quite often visible. Even in models that aren't particularly muscular, you will see this muscle showing up. That's how it attaches from the back, the lower part of this bone of the arm, I'm calling it, that scapula, out onto the arm bone as well. And it helps with that pulling motion, just like Latissimus dorsi, pulls that arm downwards or inwards. That leaves one last thing for us to look at, and that is number 15, the erector spinae muscles. Essentially what these show up as in the model are 2 columns that are quite often visible at the bottom of the back. So those bundles of muscles show up as these 2 columns at the base of the back. And in quite muscular models, the muscle of Latissimus dorsi takes over. But in thinner models, you can see these columns often extending far up into the back. This is what those muscles look like without everything else in the way. So they originate down here at the hips and they go up into the back and attach to all ribs and things. They help you stand up straight, hence the name erector spinae. Okay, and that does it for bones and muscles of the torso. It's a lot to digest, I know. We are going to work on being able to recognize the names of these muscles. Your quizzes will simply be that multiple choice. Let me know what the muscle is you're looking at. Feel free to print this PDF handout or have it on your phone or whatever you need to for taking your quizzes. And this is how the anatomy lectures are going to go. I'll talk about the bones and the muscles and their names, and we'll see them on this 3D program and talk about some of the things to watch out for. And that does it for torso anatomy.